The wind moved softly across the plains of the quiet Wild West, carrying the cool scent of autumn through fields of fading grass. Golden leaves drifted lazily from the tall cottonwood trees that lined the edges of the large ranch, spinning slowly before settling on the dusty ground. The evening sky glowed with deep shades of orange and purple as the sun slipped behind distant hills. It was the kind of peaceful evening most people admired, yet the large ranch, standing alone in the wide valley, felt strangely empty. The ranch belonged to a 36-year-old cowboy known throughout the nearby towns as a man of wealth, strength, and quiet authority. Tall and broad-shouldered, with weathered hands and steady eyes, he had built one of the most successful cattle ranches in the region. His horses were strong, his barns were full, and his land stretched farther than most people could see. Yet despite the success that surrounded him, the house at the center of the ranch remained silent almost every night. Most evenings he finished his work late, walking slowly across the yard while the wind rustled through the wooden fences. The ranch hands respected him deeply, but few knew much about the man himself. He rarely spoke about his past, and he never allowed anyone to see the quiet loneliness that followed him wherever he went. Some people in town said a man like him should have a wife and a lively home, yet year after year the large farmhouse remained empty except for him. On that particular autumn evening, he had been checking the cattle along the far pasture while the light faded. The cold air hinted that winter was not far away. By the time he returned toward the barns, darkness had begun to settle over the ranch, and the lantern near the stable door flickered gently against the wooden walls. Not far from that barn, hidden in the shadows, another soul moved quietly. She was 28 years old, though the hardship of recent months had made her appear older. Her once beautiful clothes had been worn thin by travel, and dust clung to the edges of her skirt. Long dark hair framed a face that still carried natural beauty despite exhaustion and worry. Hunger had hollowed her cheeks slightly, and her eyes carried the heavy weight of someone who had spent far too many nights wondering where the next meal would come from. For days she had walked along lonely roads and empty fields, hoping to find work in small towns that often turned her away. Some doors closed politely, others closed harshly. A few never opened at all. With no family left to rely on and no place to call home, she had slowly learned how cruel the open frontier could be to someone alone. That evening she had followed the distant site of the large ranch, hoping there might be a chance to ask for food or work. But as she approached, the size and wealth of the place made her hesitate. The barns were full, the horses strong, and the house far too grand for someone like her to knock on its door without invitation. Fear and shame kept her hidden behind the trees as night settled deeper. But hunger is a powerful force. When she noticed a small light glowing inside the barn and the faint smell of fresh bread drifting through the air, her stomach tightened painfully. Perhaps the workers had left food inside. Perhaps no one would notice if a single piece disappeared. She stood there for several long minutes, her heart beating faster as she struggled with the decision. Finally, trembling with both fear and desperation, she slipped quietly across the yard and pushed open the barn door, just enough to slide inside. The barn was warm compared to the cold outside. Lantern light cast soft shadows across stacked hay and wooden crates filled with supplies meant for the ranch workers. Her eyes quickly spotted a small loaf of bread resting beside a sack of grain. Her hand shook as she stepped closer. She had never imagined she would be the kind of person who stole food. Yet at that moment the hunger in her stomach felt stronger than the shame in her heart. Slowly she reached out, breaking off a small piece of the bread. Just as the crust cracked softly in her hands, a firm voice echoed behind her. "What do you think you're doing in my barn?" The bread nearly slipped from her fingers. She turned slowly, her face draining of color as she saw the tall cowboy standing in the doorway. His broad frame blocked the lantern light behind him, casting a long shadow across the floor. For a moment neither of them spoke. She expected shouting, anger, perhaps even the threat of being thrown out into the dark night. Instead, he studied her carefully. The first thing he noticed was not the stolen bread, but the trembling in her hands. Her clothes were worn and thin, her shoulders slightly hunched from the cold. Most of all, her eyes held a mixture of fear, shame, and exhaustion that told a story far deeper than a simple act of theft. "I'm "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was just hungry." The words felt painfully small in the quiet barn. The cowboy remained silent for a moment, looking at the piece of bread she held as if it weighed far more than it should. Then he stepped forward slowly. "You haven't eaten in days, have you?" he asked quietly. She lowered her eyes and nodded. The wind outside brushed softly against the barn walls, carrying another chill through the evening air. After a long pause, the cowboy let out a slow breath. "Well," he said gently, his voice far calmer than she expected, "you've got two choices." She looked up, confused. "You can stay here and work for your meals," he continued. "Or you can stay here and be my wife." The bread fell from her hands. The barn fell silent after the bread slipped from her hands and landed softly on the wooden floor. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The lantern light flickered gently between them, and the wind outside whispered against the walls. The woman stared at the cowboy as if she had misunderstood what he had just said. "Your wife," she repeated quietly, almost afraid to say the words aloud. The cowboy did not laugh or smile. His expression remained calm, serious, almost thoughtful, as if he had simply spoken an ordinary truth. Yet even he seemed aware that his words sounded strange in such a moment. "I didn't mean you have to decide that now," he said after a pause. "You can stay and work here if you want. The ranch always needs another pair of hands." Relief and confusion mixed inside her chest. She had expected anger, punishment, or at the very least to be forced away. Instead, she was being offered food, shelter, and work. "I can work," she said quickly. "I'll do anything you need." He nodded once. "Then pick that bread back up and eat it. No one here goes hungry." The simple kindness in his voice made her throat tighten. She bent down slowly, picked up the bread, and held it carefully. This time she did not feel like she was stealing. That night he led her to the large farmhouse that stood at the center of the ranch. From outside, the house looked warm but quiet, its windows glowing softly in the dark. Inside, the rooms were clean and comfortable, yet it was clear that the place had been lived in by only one person for a very long time. He set another loaf of bread and a bowl of stew on the wooden table. "Eat," he said simply. She did not need to be told twice. Hunger overcame her hesitation, and she ate slowly at first, then with growing relief as warmth spread through her body. The cowboy sat across from her, quietly watching the way the exhaustion in her face slowly softened. After she finished, he showed her a small room at the end of the hallway. "You can sleep here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we'll talk about the work." She hesitated at the doorway. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. He leaned against the wall for a moment before answering. "Because I know what loneliness looks like," he replied. That was all he said before walking away. The next morning the ranch woke early with the rising sun. Horses stomped in the stables, cattle moved across the fields, and the crisp autumn air carried the smell of fresh earth and hay. True to her word, the woman began working immediately. At first she helped with small tasks, sweeping the kitchen, washing dishes, and preparing simple meals for the ranch hands. Though she had been weak from hunger only a day earlier, she worked carefully and with determination. The ranch workers were surprised to see a new face, but the cowboy's quiet authority meant no one questioned her presence. Days slowly turned into weeks. As autumn deepened, the ranch began to change in subtle ways. The once quiet farmhouse now held the sound of footsteps, dishes clinking in the kitchen, and sometimes even laughter drifting through the halls. She repaired torn curtains, swept dust from forgotten corners, and filled the empty house with the warmth of daily life. Flowers began appearing in small jars on the windowsills, and fresh bread often cooled on the kitchen table. The cowboy noticed these changes even if he rarely spoke about them. At first their conversations were simple and careful. They discussed chores, weather, and the needs of the ranch. Yet little by little those conversations grew longer. Sometimes they shared supper after the workers had gone home. Other evenings, they sat quietly on the porch watching the sunset spread across the endless plains. During one of those evenings, she finally asked about the loneliness he had mentioned. He stared out at the distant hills before answering. "Years ago, I almost had a family," he said slowly. But life out here can take things from you when you least expect it. He did not explain further, but the sadness in his voice said enough. She understood loss in her own way. My parents died when I was young, she told him one night. After that I trusted the wrong people. When everything fell apart, there was no one left. The quiet honesty between them began building a fragile kind of trust. Yet not everyone in town was as accepting. When the woman first visited the general store with the cowboy, whispers followed them through the aisles. Some townspeople wondered where she had come from. Others looked at her worn past and doubted she belonged anywhere near the wealthy ranch owner. She tried to ignore the murmurs, but the shame she had carried for months returned. Later that day she told him she did not want to cause trouble for him. "You gave me a chance when no one else would," she said. "If people think badly of you because of me—" He interrupted her before she could finish. "I don't much care what people think," he said firmly. Then he surprised her again. "She works harder than anyone here," he told the store owner loudly enough for others to hear. "And as long as she's on my ranch, she's welcome." The words silenced the whispers. That night, as they walked back toward the farmhouse under a sky filled with stars, she felt something unfamiliar growing inside her heart. For the first time in many months, she no longer felt like she was simply surviving. She felt like she belonged somewhere. And though neither of them said it aloud yet, both had begun to realize that the empty spaces in their lives were quietly being filled by each other. Autumn slowly faded across the wide plains, and the golden leaves that once danced through the ranch yard disappeared beneath cold winds and gray skies. The air carried a sharper chill now, a quiet warning that winter was not far away. Each morning the grass glistened with thin frost, and the distant mountains looked pale beneath heavy clouds. Yet the ranch no longer felt like the lonely place it once had been. Inside the farmhouse, warm light glowed from the windows every evening. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and simmering stew, and the sound of quiet footsteps moved through the halls that had once echoed with silence. The woman who had arrived hungry and desperate now moved through the house with confidence, as if she had always belonged there. She woke before sunrise most mornings, tying her hair back as she prepared breakfast for the workers. The ranch hands had grown used to her cheerful greetings and warm meals, and many of them now spoke of how different the place felt compared to the quiet ranch they had known before. The cowboy noticed it too. Some evenings he would pause at the barn door and look toward the house, where warm light spilled across the yard. Months earlier he would have returned to a silent building and eaten supper alone. Now he often found her waiting at the table, 2 plates prepared, as if it had always been that way. But as winter approached, another feeling began growing quietly in the woman's heart. Fear. Not the same fear she had felt the night she stole the bread, but a softer, deeper worry that she tried to hide. She had been given kindness, work, and a place to rest, yet part of her wondered if it could last forever. Sometimes she watched the cowboy from across the room while he spoke with the workers or studied his ranch records. He had never mentioned his strange proposal again after that night in the barn. At first she had been relieved. The idea had seemed impossible, but now the silence left her uncertain. One evening, as the wind howled outside the farmhouse windows, she stood alone in the kitchen staring at the flickering lantern. Snow clouds gathered beyond the hills, promising the first storm of the season. Perhaps it was time for her to leave before she became something she was never meant to be. She began quietly packing the few belongings she had gathered over the past months. They were simple things: a shawl, a pair of boots the cowboy had bought for her in town, and a small wooden comb resting on the dresser. Just as she folded the shawl, a soft knock sounded at the open door. She turned to see the cowboy standing there. "You're packing," he said calmly. She lowered her eyes, embarrassed to be caught. "I didn't want to cause trouble," she said softly. "You gave me a place when I had nothing. I thought maybe it's time I moved on." For a moment he simply stared at the small bundle of belongings on the bed. Then he stepped inside. Outside, the wind carried the first faint snowflakes across the yard. "You think I helped you because I felt sorry for you?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "I thought maybe." He shook his head slowly. "I helped you because that night in the barn, when you thought your life had fallen apart, you still apologized for taking a piece of bread." His voice softened. That told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person you are. The room fell silent except for the wind brushing against the windows. Then he stepped closer. "Do you remember what I said to you that night?" he asked. Her heart beat faster. Of course she remembered. The words had stayed with her every day since. "You said I could stay and work," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "I said something else too." At that moment the first snow began falling heavily outside, covering the ranch in a quiet blanket of white. "I asked if you'd stay and be my wife," he said gently. Her breath caught in her throat. "That wasn't a joke," he continued, "and it wasn't pity." He looked around the room, at the shawl folded on the bed and the small bundle she had prepared. "This ranch used to feel bigger than it really was," he said. "Too quiet, too empty." Then he looked back at her. "But ever since you walked into that barn, everything changed. The house feels alive again. I wake up in the morning knowing someone else is here, someone who cares about this place." His voice softened even more. "You turned my house into a home." Tears slowly filled her eyes. "No one has ever said something like that to me," she whispered. He reached out gently, taking her trembling hands in his. "I'm saying it now," he replied. "So I'll ask you again." Outside the snow fell thicker, covering the fields and fences in white silence. "Will you stay here?" he said. "Not as someone passing through, but as my wife." For a moment she could not speak. All the fear, hunger, and loneliness she had carried for so long seemed to fade beneath the warmth of that single question. Finally she nodded through quiet tears. "Yes," she whispered. The small wedding took place only weeks later, once the snow had settled across the valley. It was simple, just as both of them preferred. The ranch workers attended, along with a few townspeople who had come to respect the quiet strength of the woman who had changed the ranch. Laughter filled the farmhouse that evening, and warm lantern light shone through the windows, while snow covered the fields outside. The ranch that once echoed with silence now held something far more valuable than wealth or land. It held love, and sometimes, on quiet winter nights, when the wind brushed softly against the barn walls, the cowboy would remember the night a hungry stranger had stolen a piece of bread. It had been the smallest moment, yet it had led them both to the home they had been searching for all along.